everyone, and welcome to another episode of Conversations with Certrec. I'm Michelle Thomas, and with me today is Evans Heacock, Certrec's Office of NERC Compliance Director. We are here today to discuss FAC-008, why it's so challenging from a compliance standpoint, some lessons learned, a recent violation, and much more. Now, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A section at any point during our discussion, and we will get to as many questions as we can. So with that, Evans, let's have a conversation.
Certainly. So
we're here today to discuss FAC-008. So at a high level, can you tell us what the standard consists of?
Yes, so from a high level for FAC-008, it is actually to look at your ratings for your equipment that deliver power to the bulk electric system. And what that could mean from a generator standpoint is the generator out to your point of interconnection. So things like your bus work from the generator, ISFAs, cable bus, transformers. Then going onto the high side, you go out in your switch yard. You have your connections out in the switch yard, your aluminum bus that's out there, your jumpers, your switches, your breakers. Lots of little pieces of equipment that go with it. So also are your current transformers as a big part of that. That anything that's in line for your power going from your generator out to the system, and then also out from the switch yards along your transmission lines. So all that equipment is included. So it's not some small amount, it's all piece parts for the distribution system and the transmission of power.
So it's got quite a few things in there.
Yes, it does. And it has quite a lot. And then with all those, you have to have the methodology that goes behind evaluating the thermal capacity of all those.
Right, and that's the facility ratings methodology.
That's the facilities ratings methodology, correct.
Okay. So with all of that complexity, based on your experience, why do you think that complying with FAC-008 is so hard?
So what we've seen, the various audits and also talking with the various regional entities on this is that a lot of times pieces are left out, like some of these that we've talked about and I mentioned a minute ago. You may not have all your CTs in there. It's kind of easy to forget some of those because they're maybe buried in bushing CTs from breakers or something or transformers. The other part of it is the little jumpers that connect between breakers and switches or switches and your aluminum bus. All those little components have to have an evaluation on them to make sure that they're thermally rated to be able to carry that power. So that's a big part of it is those items are forgotten about because it seems obvious, but they're not obvious. So you have to really think about it and make sure you get all those in your list.
So is it forgotten about, or is it sometimes maybe a lack of understanding of everything that should be included?
So that's the biggest part of it. It's a lack of understanding of everything that should be included. And that's why I would say the term forgotten about. It's that understanding of what is in the overall FAC-008 list that you need to go through and make sure that you're evaluating. Again, some of the other items that are forgotten is changes to the facility. So when you also do an upgrade or you're changing out relays, changing out breakers, changing out switches, people forget to do an update and make sure they have a configuration control or a change management control in place. So that's the other part that's forgotten and makes it difficult.
So you have to have an understanding of what really applies to FAC-008 and then have a list, I assume, of everything that you're tracking and then updates. All of these steps are difficult.
Exactly. So yeah, what you want to do is make sure that you have some proof so you get into some of the evidence. So you end up with a list. You take your drawings, go through your drawings, make sure you start putting all that on the list. You can put stuff together however it makes sense to you. Usually, folks do it in types of equipment or at voltage levels. So if you're at a high voltage scenario, 138 type scenario, piece parts, you put all those piece parts together. But you just look at it and do it methodically. Go from your start point to your end point. Make sure that you're putting all that together in your list and just go through and make sure you have a basis for it. So you start looking at having your equipment ratings, which could be based on equipment manufacturing information or based on ANSI information and ANSI IEEE. And then also making sure that you include other information like ambient conditions. Temperature has a big effect, especially on transmission lines, right? The hotter it gets, the less you're going to have to be able to push power over those lines because it causes more sag. So there's a lot of different items that you have to consider along with just the straight equipment manufacturing information.
That's a lot of information to track.
Yes, it
keep
is.
up with and update.
Yep.
So I can see how that would be really challenging from the standpoint. So what are 3 steps, maybe 3, 5, whatever number you come up with, that registered entities should or could be taking right now to ensure they're in compliance with FAC-008 or that they're managing that standard well?
So for like a generator, we'll start with generators. The big thing there is to go ahead and take their list. Look at your list. Make sure you compare that now against your drawings. Go ahead and do a walkthrough on your drawings. Make sure all the components are there. And then the next step is to go ahead and say, do I have all my information that goes with those? Look at your equipment rating sheets, comparisons to IEEE standards or ANSI standards. Make sure you have all the backup information that goes with that piece of equipment to say, this is what the amperage rating they're good for, from a thermal standpoint. And then one of the next steps is actually walk down your equipment. Say, take your list and your drawing and go out in your switch yards, go out to your generators, at your transmission lines and look at it and say, okay, looking up here, I see this, this, and this, but I don't have this. So you can make sure you have it. And then the next thing is look at nameplates. Go ahead and compare your equipment ratings to nameplates out there. Do a spot check. You can do a spot check or full. It depends on how far you want to go.
Sure.
But you can look at it and say, my drawing says this is 2,000 amp, but my nameplate says it's 3,000. So there's a discrepancy, and you want to make that correction into your list and make sure you get it updated. And which gets back to probably configuration management of some sort, that maybe along the way something changed and it wasn't fully documented. So
sure. So it sounds like left to right, top to bottom.
Yep.
Check it all out.
Yep.
So is that a one person job, or what's a good number to have a check on that?
So typically you want to have at least 2 people, and the reason for that is somebody's usually to make sure you're doing right, a preparer and then a reviewer. Preparation can be more than one, depending on how big of a system you have. How big your switch wire might be, how big your how many generating units you might have. You might want to break that down if you're trying to do it quickly. You may want to break it down to several people. And then the other part of that would be the reviewer on the back end. Somebody to say, okay, I've now finished and I want somebody to do a check on myself, so that you are confident that you have the right information in your list.
So how often should they do the full walk down, a registered entity? Or, I assume they want to do, your complete list in the beginning. You want to do a really good walk down. You want to make sure it's pristine in the beginning, but then as they're updating it or keeping it going, how often should that activity occur?
So that's going to really vary from place to place. A bigger part is going to be if you're going to have a change coming up, do it after a change, any kind of change that you have in your plan or switch yard or transmission line. If not, about every year or 2, go back out there and just do a quick random spot check. You don't have to check everything, but do a random check to see what's might have changed out in the switch yard or in the connections. Transformers changed, got new capacitor banks or something.
But as things change, it sounds like you need to have a good change management process in place to ensure, the changes get put in the documentation and you manage all of that. Is that?
And that's something that NERC is starting to look at closer. And that's one of the bigger issues that they found along the ways is that you're not, when they find a violation, it's mainly because there's not been a good change management process or a change management. Good is relative. But having one, making sure that when the change is done, there's a feedback to making sure all the rest of the documentation is updated, drawings are updated, and then really it comes back down to your FAC information. Because again, that's going to change you change out a transformer, it's going to change out your data point, and you're making sure that you're looking at it properly from a standpoint of, is it thermally rated to carry the load that's going to go through it.
Sure. And, I assume sometimes we've seen people doing the right processes, the right change process, the right update process, but if it's not written down for an auditor, it never happened, right?
That's correct.
So is there a suggestion there on how they should be sure to document that they've done that change management properly?
Yeah, so there are some ways and actually different methods to do that. If you have a change management, it's good to have a process at your site or your corporation level that actually goes through there. There's some industries out there that have done a very good job with change management over the years. They've developed them over the years. And really some of that can be taken over into the world of power generation and power distribution and transmission. down the road, and that's going to be the biggest thing, and really the next, I think, thing that NERC's going to do. Of course, I'm doing this speculatively here, but it's something, again, that the auditors are looking at and seeing that when they're looking at the FAC-008, it's not up to date because something changed and it was not caught.
It wasn't caught in the way.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So let's switch gears here a little bit. There was a recent violation that had a large monetary fine associated with it for FAC-008. So can you talk a little bit about what happened, what the violations were?
Yeah, so at a very high level, of course, like you say, the violation was out there. And this is part we haven't really talked about too much yet, but it was the methodology. So you need to track your equipment, and then you need to say, how am I evaluating all this? The evaluation is the methodology. So if you have a methodology that you're saying, I'm rating all my equipment to, IEEE, again, INC, or an engineered type analysis that goes along with that, then you need to make sure you're meeting that requirement. Well, what happened with this particular entity is they said, we're following this particular methodology, but when they actually went out and looked, it did not meet that methodology. And that's what the auditors found when they were doing their audit during this particular utility, and said, yeah, you're not meeting it, here you're not meeting it, so you really must not be following and using this particular methodology. You need to rethink this. So
were they inconsistently implementing the methodology, or were they just, maybe that's a tough question.
So yeah, so a little speculation on my part.
Sure.
It does not look like they were following their methodology, you know, consistently or inconsistently. They said one, and it was never validated, I would say. You know, that's where this check comes back in. You know, you want to have somebody prepare it and then have somebody check it just to make sure everybody's in agreement and they understand, and you have a good feel that that's the correct methodology, correct approach.
Okay. So when you're initially doing the thinking on the methodology, is that going to be different for each registered entity, or is there just a good methodology for FAC-008?
And it varies. Generators, it's going to be pretty much the same. You're going to be using the equipment ratings. That's the easiest thing to do. That way you don't have to develop something or have an engineering firm come in and come up with some sort of evaluation for it, or, you know, a methodology, or use the IEEE. And you can also have a mixture, but typically the equipment manufacturer will give you their ratings, and you use that as your basis for your equipment rating, you know, within your list. And then your methodology is basically saying, I'm using the equipment manufacturing ratings, and then that stays pretty consistent. That's probably the easiest, most straightforward. Transmission a little different, especially with transmission lines.
Of course.
Because they, you know, a lot of different folks use and calculate SAG, you know, for the thermal ratings, you know, either normal operation or emergency ratings for their transmission lines. So that's going to vary a little bit, and that's more of an engineered, if they're not using standard type SAG charts. And
sure. Well, everybody likes to be different.
Yes, typically they are.
Okay, so with FAC-008, there's an upcoming implementation deadline. What changes are happening with that?
That's correct. So for FAC-008, they're going to TAC 5 or Rev 5 of that particular standard. It'll be out in October. It'll be enforceable October 1st of this year. And basically all that is doing is removing some requirements. They've actually removed several requirements prior in the existing version of FAC-008. They're actually removing requirement 7, so it's a little less, but really doesn't change anything for the generators or the transmission companies for what they need to do for the facilities ratings.
So it doesn't simplify it in any way.
No, it doesn't really simplify, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, but from a standpoint of what you might need to change for the various entities out there, not a lot. It just removes one requirement, which was somewhat duplicative of another requirement in there.
Got it. So they just cleaned it up a little bit.
Yeah, and the other reason for going from TAC 3, right now it's FAC-008 TAC 3 to TAC 5, is they accidentally removed one extra requirement that needed to stay, so they had to put back in. So when TAC 4, they removed one. They said, no, we need to put it back in, so it went to TAC 5.
All right, well, that works.
Yeah.
So obviously, you know quite a bit about FAC-008. So can you help us understand what exactly Certrec's role is with FAC-008 and how we can help registered entities out there?
Certainly. So for FAC-008, most of our clients, what we do is we actually develop the methodology and the list of equipment that is needed for the particular entity. So we'll go straight from the generator, look at all the drawings. We'll ask questions on whether or not you've had updates, you know, there's a number of older sites, and then we also have a number of new sites. But we'll basically look at the drawings, pull all that information into a spreadsheet, and we'll get all the equipment information for it. Who's the manufacturer, and then come up with that rating. Then, state what the methodology is in there, and put all that equipment in there, and then say what the most limiting thermal piece of equipment is per the standard. Have all that together. But we'll put all that together and then track it.
Okay, so we help with the methodology. If they need help with that. It's the facility list that you talked about in a spreadsheet, and then obviously tracking is a big piece of it, and the change management piece. So we can help from beginning to end, it sounds like.
That's right.
Perfect. All right, well, that's the questions I have for us to get started. We have some really great questions from the audience.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn to those and start asking some of these awesome audience questions. So the first one came from Norick. He's wanting to know how FAC-008 is applied in NERC.
Okay. Hey, Norick, how you doing? Good question. Again, pretty much what we've described earlier. So any part that you need to do to meet it, which is going to be facilities ratings and facilities methodology, either generation or transmission. These are the owners for those. You'll need to make sure that you have that information like we described already.
Great. So the next question comes from Hector. So how do I document equipment ratings for protective system components? So I think we've talked a little bit about that as well.
Hey, Hector. That's a good question. So how do you do it for protective equipment? Big first step of that is going to be the inline component, which is going to be your current transformer, CT. You got to look at that, look at the ratings for it, make sure you understand your primary and secondary ratings. And then you're going to look at what the load is, what kind of current flows through those, and you're going to make sure you transform based on the CT ratio. Look at what your secondary current is going to be. Make sure that your CT can actually handle that load, usually 5 amps. And some of these have a ratings factor that go with them so they can go actually operate at a higher level. And then you're going to look at your protected device and see what the current is through your protected device and make sure your protected device can handle it. Typically in the US, most of the time these are 5 amps. So if you're 5 amps or less, you're not going to have any issues. A lot of relays do have a higher rating that they can actually go to continuously, and you just have to compare that. And, if you're over on current, then you just have to compare that against the manufacturer information like we talked about.
So does that get documented in the facilities list?
Yes, it does. So that evaluation actually goes through it because that's still, in the end, you're looking to see what your limiting components are so that you can identify those and have that, which is one of the requirements of FAC-008, that you identify your most limiting component.
Got it. Okay. Excellent. So this question is from Anonymous. What do I do if I want to take credit for emergency ratings?
Okay, so emergency ratings are interesting. If you take credit for it, you're going to have to say what is your power limit that you're going to go to. Number one, you have to figure out what that's going to be. And then you'll have to look at what that power rating is that you're going to be, and I'm assuming this it could be just generation and transmission. You have both. You're going to be looking at what your thermal capacity is of those. If it's in generation, you're going to look at all your equipment again. You're going to go back and compare it to what your list is and say, can I handle that? Looking at the equipment list, based on the ratings. If it's on transmission, you're going to end up having to look at that. And that's, like I was saying earlier, that's going to be typically going to be looking at what the analysis and what the utility uses or the owner of that transmission line uses to calculate those thermal ratings. So you'd have to factor that in. So, some of those, it's definitely as wind speeds can be an issue. The ambient temperatures are an issue with those. So there's a lot of little factors that you have to consider, and it's going to be more than I can give you right now. But if you like to talk with us, you can get back in touch with us and we can go over that in more detail.
So is it somewhat subjective as to having those included, or should they or shouldn't they be included, or is there pretty clear guidance?
It's fairly clear. So most, go from a generation, transmission typically does have emergency ratings. Because a lot of times they'll go into an overload. They may have a situation that causes them to go to overload. Generation is going to be typically what the base rating of your machine is, because generators like turbine generators, wind generators, they're going to only be able to produce so much power. And typically it's done at the max power, that all the analysis is done at the max power rating. So you don't really have an emergency rating that you'd have to for generation, but on transmission you do, because northeastern blackout, kind of an example of that, is they started losing transmission lines, and those transmission lines, remaining ones, started have to go into emergency ratings, and started overloading, and which spread quickly. So you do have to consider them, and at that point, it gets into what's a specific, especially for transmission.
So it's very specific to the registered entity.
Yes.
For being included.
Yep.
Got it. So another question from Anonymous. My facility's output capability is limited by something other than generators. What do I need to do?
Okay, well, when you say limited by something else, I'd actually need a little bit more information to know what that is. When you say it's limited, what that item is that's limiting you. But I would say if you want to talk about this one a little bit more, get in touch with us so I can talk to you, because that's not quite enough to know. But, as I will add and caveat that was whatever that extra source of power is, which could be a capacitor bank or inductor that's causing current to go up when they're in service. You need to include those current ratings as you're going through to your POI for a generator. It's whatever else can cause your currents to go up that you'd have to include.
Gotcha. All right. Another question here. From NERC, another one. Is there any sample FAC-008 engineering report? If yes, how can we have it?
Well, you get in touch with us.
Right.
It's going to be entity, what their wants are, what's driving, they want their reports to look like. Mm-hmm. Everybody sets them up a little differently. I know there's been some that have been giving, like PRC5. I know NERC has some generic ones. There's some also for FAC-008. But the bigger part is, what do you want it to look like? What makes sense to you, and a company? Again, we have a way that we set them up that makes sense to us and may not necessarily make sense to everybody, but we try to set it up in a logical manner. Like I said, usually grouping equipment together that makes sense in that voltage level, so that you can go to it quickly and say, okay, yeah, this is what I'm looking for, this item right here. Then naming conventions. So some of that's going to be, am I naming this correctly on my spreadsheet so I can figure it out?
Sure.
And, and then other additional items. One of the big ones these days is make sure you include CTs for metering. They're not necessarily a load, have a relay load, but they're a series connected device that a lot of the regional entities are now looking at to make sure those are included in your ratings.
Sure. So we have a version. There's more than one way to skin a cat, I guess.
Yep.
And so, it works. We know it works. But, give us a call, right?
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So this question's from Robert Jones. If your facility rating is limited by the licensed thermal rating of the reactor, how should this be handled?
That's a very good question. And actually, I probably have been there in the past with one of my past sites. What I would say to do in this situation and went through an audit with was use that as, it's given in the tech specs for nuclear power source. And then use that and go through your, there's usually some sort of a heat balance, a heat transfer diagram that goes for your turbines. So you produce so many BTUs into your turbine generator set, and it says this is what you get out. That's what you can use as your basis. So your thermal capacity goes into a diagrammatic, but it's a thermal cycle that's usually given by your turbine generator manufacturer. And then what that information is out of your generator is what you would go with to say, here's your limit.
Interesting. Good question.
So that's a good question. It is a very good question. And
yeah.
we can talk with you more on that if you'd like to. Like I said, give us a shout.
Sounds like you've been there.
I have.
All right. We got another question from Anonymous. Do GOs need evidence that their relay settings aren't limiting plant capability?
So that's a very good question right now. A lot of discussion on that in the FAC-008 world right now. And a big part of that is looking at what is required by the standard. The standard is not necessarily looking by the black and white of it, looking at the settings themselves. What's kind of coming across is that's a question in the RSAW. And so therefore it's kind of being drug into the question. That does not necessarily mean that that's part of FAC-008. The settings are not necessarily something that you're comparing against your FAC-008. This will be, I think, a little controversial for a little while. But if you look at the black and white, it's not part of it. that setting is not part of it. That's actually, most of those settings are evaluated properly in the PRCs, PRC 19, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27 kind of a thing. That's really where you're looking at those settings to make sure that they're set properly.
So right now it might just be a little bit of bleed over.
Yes, it's a little bit of bleed over. Again, regulators have been asking this, the regional entities have been asking the question. You're going to have to handle that on a case by case, and that's going to be the touchy part of how to work through that. It's not really a requirement of FAC-008, but it is in the RSAW, so they're pulling it in because of that.
Gotcha.
That is a very good question, though.
Is it fair for them to maybe be a little pushback when asked for that in FAC-008 and suggest that, it's in a different standard if they want to look at that information?
Exactly. And with regulations, any kind of regulations, any industry you're in, it's always fair to push back, and you can push back and have those conversations with your regulator. And you want to do it, you don't want to do it in a confrontational manner, but try to discuss it, talk through it, and then, try to provide that feedback to them. And all you can do is do that and see where it goes. But yes, I personally would push back on that. That's my point of view. Now, it's not going to be necessarily everybody's, but that's my point of view.
Yeah. And I think, it's been our experience, if you have and build a good relationship with your auditor, your regional entity, those conversations might be a little easier to have, especially if you're being appropriate and, not confrontational, like you say, but a good relationship with your auditor is a good idea. It's
always a good thing. Yes. You do want to develop some sort of repertoire with your auditor. You don't want to be confrontational, because that just sets up barriers, in general, that's going to make your audit harder anyway. So.
Great. So we talked a little bit earlier about, FAC-008 and why it's so challenging. We do have the question here. What is the most common reason for FAC-008 noncompliance? Is it the same as what we talked about earlier, where it's not understanding what goes in, the small things? What do you think is the main reason? Yes,
and that's true. We have talked about this. The biggest part is configuration control. That's what we're getting feedback from audits that we support, is that we may not necessarily get back, or the site's not incorporating the changes, which we'll talk about. That's why you would want to do the walk downs later, every so often. If you know there's a change coming, and make sure you're preparing and making sure all your documentation is updated. But yeah, configuration control is the biggie.
Key. Got it.
Yep.
Keeping track of everything. Okay. We have another good question from NERC. Facilities are rated based on generator rating, not reactor thermal rating. Is that correct?
So typically when you're trying to go through and do your FAC-008, you're going to want to do it on generator ratings for the most part, because that's going to typically be higher. Your MVA out of your machine, your generator, is going to be higher than what your reactor can do thermally when you're spinning the turbine. So yes, you do. It's easier to go through and say, this is what we're producing, because it's going to be the worst case, because that's what our generator is rated for. And then you can, just as a check, you can say, okay, yeah, my thermal power out of my reactor will never get me there. Now, one of the things that has happened over the years, especially with nuclear power plants, is that they've done power up rates. So, and they have not changed the generators. So there's going to be a little bit of a change. So sometimes what changes is going to be the power factor, what they say they can produce out of that machine. So you'll have to do some adjustments, especially if there's been a large increase in that power out of the reactor, due to that thermal increase that they got from the NRC.
So is your answer, it depends?
It depends.
The famous answer, it depends.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of that. It's everything has to be considered,
sure.
Within it. The newer units will be generator limited. Some of the older units with power up rates will be power up rated limited by thermal capacity of the reactor.
Got it. Excellent. So we have another question here from Dave. So how would the dynamic ratings affect the calculations and the evidence required to determine compliance?
Say that one again.
Okay. It is a long one. How would the dynamic ratings affect the calculations and evidence required to determine compliance?
Okay. So Dave, that is a good question. And I would say, again, that's going to be one of those I think we need to have a conversation separately, because I need to understand what you're thinking of from dynamic. Typically, a dynamic is not in there. It's usually going to be on the steady state values for generation. Transmission can be a little bit more dynamic, especially short-term ratings for thermal overloads on transmission you'll look at. But dynamic typically will not get in there if we're talking about short circuits, if you're talking about that, or fast power swings. It's not typically something you get into. You're looking at steady state, and because you're not going to be there very long if it's dynamic. That's kind of the idea. But I would rather have a little bit more conversation with you on this.
All right. So, Dave, we need more details. So reach out to us. All right, Hector is the next question. For a multi-unit facility, do I need to provide ratings for a unit less than 20 MVA?
That's a very good question. So getting into aggregate generation and the rule of I4 on the BES of the bulk electric system, you do have to consider it if your overall generation is greater than 75 MVA. So if you sum up all your generation, you need to see if it's greater than 75, then you would have to include that generator that's less than 20 MVA.
Okay. So overall 75.
Overall 75 MVA.
That's the key number.
That's the key number. Yes.
Okay.
And this is I4, which is dispersed. So if you have a single generator, that's when the 20 MVA comes in.
Okay. Numbers do matter.
Yes.
Okay. So I don't think I've asked this one yet. Anonymous again. Which components of dispersed generation facilities should be included?
So that's another one of those good questions. The regulators and the regional entities are pretty much looking generator back to your collector bus. So anything that goes with the collector bus where you're summing up to, like we're talking about a minute ago, 75 MVA. So you have to include all that. That's 75 MVA. They do want to understand what your generator is rated at. And some are actually looking at the circuit from the generator, which could be, say, like in wind, you have one windmill at the very end, and then you have several others connected in series where it goes to the collector bus. Some will be interested in that cable feed to make sure that it actually is rated properly, along with the transformer. Typically, that's at the base. You may see some of these at the base of the wind generation units that pushes the voltage up from the generator voltage up to the collector bus, which is about 34.5 kV. So a lot of little components, but collector bus,
it's a lot.
Where you aggregate that power is where you have to really consider it, and then out a little bit.
And then out from there.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, excellent. Another question here from Sean LaForce. The 42M involved clearance measurements for transmission lines. Can you speak to why this is a FAC-008 requirement?
It's a good question, Sean. This one, my biggest area is not necessarily transmission, but I would like to get you to call us back. I do know Sean. We've dealt with Sean. So if you would get us separately, get a hold of us separately, and we can talk to that. I need to get my SME that's on this to be able to answer that one.
On the fun transmission.
Yeah.
It's a
I
whole
apologize
different
for that.
world.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, are there any other insights or tips you can provide the people watching for FAC-008 and things that could help them be successful with compliance?
I think not more than what we said. The biggest part is make sure you're tracking all your documents. Have a list. Go over that list periodically. Make sure you have the background and the information that supports the thermal ratings for that equipment on that list. If it's either going to be from the vendor or you're going to come up with something from IEEE, ANSI standards that says that this is how this is rated. Make sure you have some sort or looking at a configuration control. Maybe just ask yourself once a year, even kind of a thing. You may not have some, but say, what has changed in the last year? Ask yourself that question. And then if you don't know, go out to your people at the plant and say, what have we changed out here? I may not know about. There's a lot of times a lot of things change over the year very easily. Relay can change. A lot of changes right now in automatic voltage regulators. Big one there, but you kind of need to watch out. It's not so much of a FAC-008 thing, but I'm just going to say this as a general. That affects you in different areas like a PRC-19. So just configuration control is not just for FAC-008. It's for all your standards out there that have anything to do with settings and controls, of your generation out. So
sure.
Make sure somebody looks at your methodology periodically. It's good to have a peer check, have that check and then have a peer check, and maybe every so often do a random check, say, okay, here's my methodology. Does it apply here, and does it apply here? Is it the right methodology?
For what you need to do.
Yeah.
And make a list and check it twice.
Twice, yep.
I kept saying that in my mind as you were discussing that. So, you've mentioned a lot of things that have to be tracked or reminders that need to be made to go do different things. Can you talk a little bit about how Certrec keeps up with all the different due dates, the evidence that needs to go in, all the tracking that Certrec does? What do we use for that?
Okay, so our main item is a program, a app, which is called CATS, Certrec Action Tracking System. And it's a way of looking at making sure that you're meeting your requirements. So it has dates in there, due dates, and then it has completion dates to say, yeah, I'm doing it the way it should be. The biggest part of it is due dates, and you get a report out saying this is coming due and you need to be ready for it, kind of a thing. The other part is that it can also store any evidence that comes out of the action that's necessary, either from a Mod 25 standpoint. You put your test results in there. PRC 19, you put your evidence of the analysis report in there. And then you can project way out, and it's not just a short-term tracking, it's long-term. You can do year, actually 3 months, years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, whatever your standard requires. You can put that in so it automatically reminds you so you don't forget about it. And it can actually set it up to where it automatically reminds you. So we have tools, nice tool like that. Plus, like we talked about earlier, we do the FAC-008, we put all that together for you for your facilities ratings, come up with a methodology, and make sure that looks correct. And of course, we do prepare and checks internally to make sure we capture everything.
So what do you think is the greatest benefit the team receives from using the action tracking system versus, say, tracking everything in a spreadsheet?
Well, yeah, spreadsheets are infamously problematic in the first place. So the biggest part is that if you're using a spreadsheet, it's going to get out of date. There's a lot of times it gets out of date, or somebody updates it and somebody has an old version and they send that old version because they didn't know it got updated to somebody else, and everybody individually is updating this thing. Where CATS is real time. You can go in anytime, anywhere, and have multiple people in at the same time doing their update, and it's done. Once you do it, it's done and it's tracked, and you don't have to do anything else or worry about anything else. So, and
it reminds you, and
it reminds you, yes. And you can have, and it's automatic reminders. You can have it sent to everybody on the team, or whoever's necessary to be on it. It could be your maintenance folks, and it could be somebody in the engineering department. It could be somebody in NERC compliance.
So it can be spread across your whole organization.
That's correct.
Excellent. So we had another question come in from Norick. What is the difference between nuclear and fossil plants FAC-008 reports?
Nothing. Essentially, ends up being pretty much just the same. Once you know what your generator is rated for, or your thermal output of your generation, there's really no difference. It's treated the same as far as what you need to look at. So from generator terminals out to your point of interconnection, you have to look at all that equipment, make sure that your equipment is thermally rated all the way out, and then determine what that most limiting component is. So there's really no difference.
They're the same. Interesting.
Yeah.
So instead of it depends.
That's right. It's no difference in this case.
Interesting. Well, everyone, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this Conversations with Certrec discussing FAC-008. We appreciate all of the questions that were asked today and hope that we've provided some valuable insights and answers. Now, it's no secret that FAC-008 is a difficult standard to comply with, and the Certrec team of experts is standing by, ready to assist you and your registered entity with any challenges you may be facing with FAC-008. For more information on how we can empower you with Certrec's products and services, send us an email at support@certrec.com or give us a call at 817-738-7661, and we'll get you connected with one of our NERC experts. We hope to see you next time, and take care.